As China's economy continues to stagnate and numerous industries face decline, citizens are struggling under the weight of a severe unemployment crisis. Despite local governments grappling with financial shortfalls, the Chinese Communist Party has pressed ahead with hosting the China-Africa Cooperation Forum. During the event, Xi Jinping pledged an astonishing 360 billion yuan in aid to Africa over the next 3 years, sparking widespread public outrage. Many Chinese citizens already facing economic hardship view this as a blatant disregard for their suffering. The CCP's so-called money diplomacy has shook not only the domestic population, but also the international community, as no other nation has displayed such audacity in lavishly spending taxpayer money. The China-Africa Cooperation Forum, held in Beijing from September 4th to the 6th, saw Xi Jinping announce the new aid package on September 5th. The 360 billion yuan commitment includes 210 billion yuan in credit lines, 80 billion yuan in various types of aid, and at least 70 billion yuan to support Chinese investments in Africa. Furthermore, China will support Africa in issuing panda bonds, and has committed 1 billion yuan in emergency food aid. The plan also includes the creation of at least 1 million jobs in Africa, the provision of 1 billion yuan in military aid, and granting zero tariff treatment to 33 African nations. The announcement quickly triggered a wave of outrage on Chinese social media, with many criticizing the CCP for neglecting its own citizens while spending extravagantly abroad. People expressed their frustration, stating, "This is squandering the hard-earned money of Chinese citizens without any regard for their well-being," and "it shows the dictatorship doesn't care about its people suffering." Sarcastic remarks from Chinese netizens further reflected their dissatisfaction, with comments like, "So, all our endless unpaid overtime and crippling mortgage payments were all for the happiness of the African people." Others criticized the government for its reckless foreign spending, highlighting that while many at home are unemployed, living on the streets, facing home foreclosures, and struggling to survive, the government continues to lavishly hand out money overseas. One netizen shared a Baidu encyclopedia entry revealing that China's aid to the Democratic Republic of the Congo resulted in the implementation of free healthcare for all citizens. While this was praised as a demonstration of China's great power and its deep friendship with Africa, many within China are frustrated with the government's priorities. In China, many citizens still struggle to afford basic medical care or essential medications. Meanwhile, a CCP health insurance expert unapologetically stated that the country's financial resources and uneven distribution of healthcare services make free healthcare unfeasible. This has angered the public, who are upset by the government's generosity towards foreign nations while neglecting its own people. Many have accused the regime of treating its citizens as house slaves compared to its foreign allies. Scholars have also criticized Xi Jinping for recklessly wasting public funds to boost his international reputation at the expense of the Chinese people. Chinese-Canadian author Sheng Shu recently criticized the CCP for its long-standing habit of lavish foreign aid spending. She pointed out that during the era when tens of millions of Chinese people died from starvation, the CCP never ceased pouring money into Africa, Latin America, and other communist regimes. Now, China is again on the verge of widespread hunger, brought on by the economic downturn following the pandemic. Many regions are in severe decline, yet instead of addressing these immediate dangers, Xi Jinping is ramping up reckless foreign spending. Since Xi Jinping took office, the scale of the CCP's foreign aid has dramatically increased, leaving the world astonished. Xi has personally announced and overseen aid to Africa amounting to over 170 billion US dollars. This figure doesn't even account for the extensive cost of hosting large numbers of African students in China. In 2018, Xi chaired the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Beijing, where he outlined China's commitment to provide 60 billion US dollars in aid. This included 15 billion in grants, interest-free loans, and concessional loans, 20 billion in credit lines, 10 billion for China-Africa financial development, and 5 billion to support imports from Africa. Additionally, China waived the outstanding interest-free loan debt of African nations that had diplomatic ties with the CCP for loans that had matured by the end of 2018. At the 2015 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Johannesburg, a comprehensive strategic partnership was established between China and Africa. To ensure the implementation of the 10 cooperation plans, the CCP pledged another 60 billion US dollars in financial support. This included $5 billion in grants and interest-free loans, $35 billion in concessional loans and export credits, and an initial $10 billion for the China-Africa Industrial Capacity Cooperation Fund. The true extent of the CCP's foreign spending remains unknown to the Chinese public. Since Xi Jinping took office in 2013, he has launched the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, distributing vast amounts of loans, investments, and aid to participating countries. In 2014, the Chinese government established the $40 billion Silk Road Fund to promote economic development across Asia, providing financing for infrastructure development in industrial projects along the BRI. By 2017, Xi announced an additional $14 billion for investment into the fund. According to the New York Times, as of October 2023, China has invested nearly $1 trillion in the BRI. China's Ministry of Commerce reported that Africa has become a key region for implementing the BRI. Between 2013 and 2023, China signed contracts worth over $700 billion with African nations. Critics argue that the BRI primarily offers loans for large infrastructure projects in developing countries, leaving many African nations burdened with substantial debt. A 2022 report by Chatham House, a London-based think tank, found that Chinese loans accounted for 12% of Africa's total debt, making China the largest creditor to several African nations. To date, 52 African countries and the African Union have signed cooperation agreements with China under the BRI. This collaboration has resulted in the construction or upgrading of nearly 100,000 kilometers of roads, over 10,000 kilometers of railways, hundreds of bridges, and nearly 100 ports across the continent. Beyond infrastructure, the initiative has expanded to include cooperation in emerging fields such as green development, healthcare, finance, and digital innovation. It's also worth noting that in June 2020, following the outbreak of COVID-19, the Chinese government announced a suspension of debt repayments for 77 developing countries and regions. While labeled as a suspension, many believe that these debts will likely never be repaid. In August 2022, during one of the most severe phases of the COVID-19 pandemic in China, the CCP once again announced the cancellation of 23 interest-free loan repayments for 17 African nations. Some scholars argue that the Belt and Road Initiative, which outwardly appears to be an infrastructure investment project, is actually a means for the CCP to export corruption in its authoritarian model of governance. The CCP is accused of using bribery to buy off local officials who often flee the country with large sums of money after being removed from office, leaving behind massive debts for their citizens to repay. In other words, there is a parallel between this behavior and the corrupt actions of the CCP officials within China. Although China is the world's second largest economy, poverty remains a serious problem. According to official government statistics, nearly 1 billion Chinese citizens earn an average monthly income of less than 2,000 yuan, which accounts for almost 70% of the population. Additionally, 1% of China's population controls 90% of the nation's wealth, while the other 99% hold just 10%, underscoring the extreme disparity between rich and poor. Currently, small and medium-sized businesses in China are undergoing a wave of closures, foreign investors are pulling out, and mass layoffs are sweeping across the country. Even traditionally stable government jobs and high-level financial positions, often referred to as iron rice bowls and golden rice bowls, are experiencing salary cuts. In the midst of this economic downturn, China's 170 million rural retirees are struggling, receiving only 100 yuan per month in pension. Critics argue that if the money spent on foreign aid was redirected to support China's own citizens, it could provide basic pension security for all vulnerable elderly people, relieving their fears and anxieties. Additionally, if the 360 billion yuan pledged to Africa were used to offer subsidies to China's 36 million unemployed college graduates, each would receive a one-time payment of 10,000 yuan, stimulating significant domestic consumption. US-based independent commentator Cai Shun-kun recently posted a sharp critique, stating, "The CCP is incredibly generous towards its African brothers, but extremely frugal with its own citizens. Just look at the universal subsidy provided to elderly citizens aged 90 to 89 in Heilongjiang province. 300 yuan a year, which is 25 yuan a month, barely enough for a box of fast food. Xi Jinping's domestic and foreign policies present a stark contrast. On one hand, the CCP continues to spend lavishly abroad without hesitation. On the other hand, the government squeezes its own people, urging them to tighten their belts and live frugally. Xi has even called for local governments to smash the pot and sell the iron to cover budget deficits. Many Chinese citizens express frustration, complaining that Xi Jinping is willing to spend trillions of dollars on foreign aid, but refuses to allocate even a fraction of that amount to help struggling citizens at home. In May 2022, while the Chinese people were suffering under the Chinese government's stringent zero-COVID policy, Xi published an article offering guidance to both the Chinese public and economic experts. In a written statement, Xi Jinping addressed the need for promoting common prosperity, emphasizing that China must avoid welfarism. He pointed to Latin American countries that implemented populist policies with high welfare programs. He argued that these policies fostered a population of lazy people and those seeking to benefit without contributing. This, according to Xi, resulted in unsustainable national finances, pushing these countries into the middle-income trap from which they have struggled to escape. He warned that once welfare benefits are raised, they are difficult to reduce, and implementing welfare beyond a nation's means will inevitably lead to serious economic and political issues. The term dasabai, which literally translates as lavish spending overseas, Chinese people use it to mock Xi Jinping because it is a homophone for the vulgar phrase, big fool. It is used to ridicule Xi's commitment to foreign aid and money diplomacy since taking office. Despite public discontent and ridicule, Xi continues to hear only the praise of his sycophants, showing little concern for the negative reactions from his citizens. The international community remains puzzled by Xi Jinping's repeated lavish spending practices, which are highly unpopular among the Chinese public. To understand the reasoning behind Xi's actions, it's important to explore the various motivations behind this foreign aid strategy, which disregards domestic struggles. One of Xi Jinping's primary goals is to counter the influence of the United States by rallying allies. Xi, though ambitious, has often been criticized for lacking the necessary competence. His mindset is still rooted in the era of Mao Zedong, where he seeks to position himself as a global leader, aiming to form a new international communist alliance to oppose the US-led capitalist bloc. Xi's lavish spending abroad is an attempt to follow Mao's approach of winning over countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Essentially, he aspires to be the leader of the world's poor nations. China's history of foreign aid as lavish spending dates back decades. From 1949 to 1976, during Mao Zedong's reign, despite widespread hunger and poverty that left millions of Chinese citizens dead, the CCP provided massive economic and military aid to over 110 countries and regions, including North Korea, Vietnam, and Albania. The total aid amounted to hundreds of billions of dollars, which, when adjusted for today's currency devaluation over the past 5 decades, would be worth several trillion dollars. As a senior Taiwanese national security official pointed out during a briefing, Xi's actions are all part of a broader strategic breakout in the context of US-China competition. These include extending a hand of friendship to African nations, attempting to mediate peace in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, or flexing military muscles in the East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, and the South China Sea. In other words, Xi is positioning Beijing as a leader of the global South, especially in Africa, with a long-term goal of challenging the US and the West. A second key motivation behind Xi Jinping's foreign aid spending is to garner diplomatic backing for China. During the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, a video was widely circulated from a lecture last year by Renmin University professor Jin Kanrong, a prominent advisor to the CCP. In the video, Jin reveals many African leaders visit China with no specific agenda. They just come to Beijing to sightsee, enjoy some good food, and then express their support with one simple statement: "We firmly support the One China policy. Taiwan is an inseparable part of China." After that, they immediately ask for money. According to a Tsinghua University study, we spend around 30 billion yuan annually to maintain this principle. Jin's remarks essentially acknowledge that much of China's diplomatic support on the international stage is bought with money. The Forum on China-Africa Cooperation is undeniably aimed at strengthening China's partnership with African nations. With 55 member states in the United Nations, Africa's voting bloc offers China a critical advantage in gaining support for its positions in international affairs. In 2020, several African nations voted in favor of China's stance on multiple occasions at the UN. As US-China relations continue to deteriorate, China increasingly relies on African nations to back its positions on sensitive issues like Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang. In recent years, China has attracted large numbers of African students with generous scholarships and benefits, but this has exposed a range of serious problems. While the government promotes these programs under the banner of China-Africa friendship and cultural exchange, they highlight significant resource misallocation, a lack of attention to domestic students, and short-sighted diplomatic strategies. A third major reason behind Xi Jinping's foreign aid strategy is to address China's issue of industrial overcapacity. From an economic standpoint, the Chinese government seeks to expand global trade to find markets for its surplus production, thus mitigating the effects of the country's overall economic slowdown. Additionally, China aims to secure long-term access to strategic resources such as oil, natural gas, and minerals necessary for its continued growth. China has long been known for its extensive infrastructure projects, often referred to as infrastructure mania. Over the years, massive investments in street, cement, and other construction materials have fueled the country's economic growth. High-speed railways, highways, and urban development have connected cities across China, providing a critical boost to the economy. But this period of rapid infrastructure expansion has come to an end. With most projects completed, the domestic market can no longer absorb the excess production, leaving many steel and cement companies on the brink of bankruptcy. As a result, exporting surplus production abroad has become an urgent priority. Assistant researcher at Taiwan's National Defense and Security Research Institute, Yang Yi-Kuei, explained that the funds announced at the China-Africa Forum are, in part, a form of subsidy or stimulus designed to encourage Chinese companies to invest in China. At least half the funds are allocated to subsidize Chinese construction firms in joint ventures operating in Africa. In other words, the aid is intended to address China's current overcapacity problem, but this remains largely an idealistic plan from Beijing, and its success in reality is far from guaranteed. Associate Professor of Political Science at National Taiwan University, Chen Shermin, argues that Xi Jinping's push for new productive forces to address economic challenges such as electric vehicles, solar panels, and batteries has not been absorbed by the domestic market. To offload these surplus goods, China has resorted to selling them cheaply to foreign markets. But with European countries imposing heavy tariffs due to concerns over unfair trade practices, the CCP has turned to dumping these cheap electric vehicles in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Yet the infrastructure in these regions, such as charging stations for EVs, is often underdeveloped, and despite low prices, many local citizens still can't afford them. No matter the political or economic motivations behind CCP's foreign aid, critics see it as an exploitation of ordinary citizens. Ultimately, it is the Chinese people who bear the cost of this lavish spending. So why does the CCP feel emboldened to squander the nation's resources so recklessly? From Xi Jinping's perspective, the worst-case scenario would be isolationism. Should that happen, the CCP's propaganda machine could frame Western countries as enemies, allowing the regime to maintain its authoritarian grip over the Chinese people, much like North Korea. The root cause of public dissatisfaction with the Chinese government's lavish spending is the CCP's authoritarian rule. As the CCP tightens its control, the more it fuels resistance among the people. A young man named Wang Miaosen recently published an open letter to the Chinese platform Zihe, openly criticizing Xi Jinping for reckless and irresponsible actions. He urged the CCP's Central Commission for Discipline Inspection to revoke Xi's party membership and strip him of all positions. Wang's daring move reflects a rapid growing number of clear-minded Chinese citizens who are becoming increasingly aware of the government's actions. As this awareness continues to spread, so does the public's resistance to the CCP. Professor Chen Shermin noted that although the authorities have employed numerous coercive measures to maintain regime stability, the digital age allows information to spread rapidly. He suggested that if public outrage becomes more organized, the CCP could face a sudden collapse, much like the fall of communist regimes in Eastern Europe in 1989.